Welcome. Thank you for tuning in to Circling Dialogos and my reading and riffing on A.H. Almaas's The Pearl Beyond Price. So in the last video, we completed the first chapter. And I think just to dive right in, I want to just read the last paragraph of that first chapter before we go into the second one. This book is an exploration of the personal essence, its nature, and its relation to the ego, and to the transcendent impersonal reality. Our method is the realization and development of the personal essence through the understanding of its reflection, ego. The presence of ego points to the reality of the personal essence, just as the existence of false gold indicates the existence of true gold. Okay, so he's making, this distinction between what he's calling the ego and the personal essence. And how I'm taking that to be, it's something like the ego is a reflection of something deeply real and intrinsic to reality. That the personal essence, right, may not be something that's in division, right, standing over against a transcendent or an illusion, right, of some kind, but that there's something intrinsic to being, that a sense of personhood, personalness, right, individuality in the deepest sense of the word. That this may be an actual ontological facet of being itself. There's an internal necessity within the impersonal for the personal to arise, and that this may be an attribute of being itself. That it may not be a mistake, right? However, he's making this clear distinction that there's the personal essence, right, with what reflects it, which is the ego, right? And what he's saying is that it's through understanding the ego that we will come into contact with its ground, right? That in some sense, the distortions of the ego, right, is something like, is driven by a yearning, a kind of hunger, a spiritual hunger, but in its distortions, it just goes to the wrong address, right? It's kind of like you imagine the difference between, I don't know, Gandhi, spreading his message in front of, millions of people, and, he's Gandhi, and the guy smoking crack in the alley. I think what Almaas may say, at some very deep level, that both Gandhi and the guy in the alley have the same spiritual yearning. They're fundamentally valuing, right, and desiring, and are hungry for, are yearning for the same thing, which is ultimate reality. And we could just say that the guy in the back alley went to the wrong address. There's a distortion there. However, as we go deeper into the structure of the ego and start to understand it, and we come in contact with its ground, we're going to discover this, what Almaas is distinguishing is as the personal essence. And as I've been thinking about this, and this week, since I started reading this, about, just this question about, well, what is it to be personal, right? What is it to have a personal experience. To be a person, to be touched personally, to be moved personally. There's this, it seems to me that personhood, one, has a lot to do with relationship, right? It seems personhood, being a person, implicitly already always, right, brings into view multiple people, right? We, in some sense, we become persons through other people, right? It's through relationships with other people that transform our helpless vulnerability when we're infants into people that can talk and move and have autonomy and, right, realize God. There's this deep sense of, in other words, there's being personal is so entwined with relationality and things like intimacy and relationship in all of its forms, that we actually kind of we in some sense become the person we are through other people. And I think that happens deeply early in life, but I think it happens all through life. We're constantly coming into being through being addressed by other people. And how those relationships go, in some sense, and how we inhabit those relationships have a lot to do with the quality of that very development. So, and now what is, in what sense though is being a person and being personal intrinsically connected with the impersonal, right? Which is what Almaas is bringing into a dialectic, right? Or addressing the schism between the two. And what I've been kind of thinking about is, in some way, right? It seems to me that when we have an experience of a deep connection with the transcendent, that one of the primary ways, right, that transcendence and that connection happens, right, is via being personal, right? Being deeply touched by the stars, right? Being deeply moved, right? In other words, being able to be contacted by and to contact and come into a real relation, right, with that which is beyond us, that runs through us, however, is greater than us, right? The inexhaustible fount of intelligibility, whatever word we want to use for it, right? It seems like in some sense, the most appropriate way that is perceived, right, is precisely in a very personal way. And I've also been thinking about it this other way, in this sense of, it's kind of like, I've always had this thought, kind of a jokey thought, but it's also not a joke. It's kind of like, I ask myself the question, why did the Big Bang grow a nervous system? I mean, you really think about that. It's kind of like, I mean, there's a there's a way that we can deeply say that that's true. That is not, I mean, the Big Bang happened and it self-organized in such a way that here we are, right? These personal selves. What's why? What's going on there, right? What does it say that? Um, what does it say about all that is, about the ground of being, right? that it was possible for such a thing to happen, called individual consciousness, right? So in some respects, I mean, what we can say is that at least this is the way I've been thinking about it and reflecting about it, is that maybe our consciousness, our sense of personhood, our sense of individuality, right, our self-awareness may not be just an epiphenomena, right? But I think we can also say that it's the very way that we are one of the very ways that all that is taking a glimpse of itself, is coming into self-relationship with itself. We may be that occasion. So in other words, this sense of personalness is an actual feature, right? An aspect of being itself. And that we are one of the expressions of that. But let's see what Almaas says. Okay, chapter 2, being and ego. In most spiritual traditions and work schools, ego has had a bad name, being characterized as the devil, the tempter, the spoiler. It is typically held as the barrier against enlightenment and realization. Ego is the center of the world of illusion and suffering, a stumbling block against the realization of truth and enlightenment. Various teachings have thoroughly explored the way ego functions to resist and veil reality. Although the different teachings have varying perspectives on and descriptions of those functions. Some teachings see ego in terms of its activity, which is primarily desire for future pleasure. This desire for pleasure, which entails avoidance of pain, involves rejecting the present situation and hoping for a better one. The cycle of ego activity is thus rejection, hope, and desire. It is based on memories of past experience and is directed towards the future. Thus, ego, which here is an activity which resists the present moment, is clearly antithetical to the perception of the nature of reality, which involves being in the moment. Ego, then, is seen as antithetical to being, and therefore for being, which is the supreme reality, to be perceived and lived. Ego activity must be ceased. So I think he's probably going to go into all the different ways different traditions have generally looked at the ego, essentially. And so some of the traditions are more zero in on its insidious, incessant activity, its constant churning of the mind, its constant spinning samsara and dukkha, its constant making divisions and judgments of other people and of itself, this insidious momentum of activity, right? Many days I call that activity guysengstock, unfortunately. He goes on. Other perspectives see ego as the belief in a self or entity. The activity of ego is taken to be the activity of a person, an entity, who has desires and hopes. So here, ego is seen as taking oneself to be a person, separate from the rest of the universe, who was born to a set of parents, who was a child, who grew up in time to his present status as an adult, who has his hopes, desires, and goals. The belief that that this separate individuality is one's identity, one's self, is seen by some teachings as the main barrier to the ultimate reality, which is an impersonal and universal being, or alternatively, the void. Enlightenment, then, is the insight that one is not really this separate individual, a realization which is equivalent to the state of unqualified being or non-conceptual reality. So here he's saying that there's other traditions that emphasize not just being as the incessant activity, but seeing our ego as the insidious incessant activity, but instead see the ego as an entity, right? A selfhood, right? A kind of object, if you will, that creates an identity and has a gravity to it and illusions about it. And so some traditions look at that, the deceptions of the ego from it, and presuppose it as being an entity. He goes on, Buddhism regards ego as a collection of tendencies, skandhas, skahandas. God, these, I can barely speak English, but let alone skahandas, which, okay, Buddhism regards ego as a collection of tendencies, skandhas, which are taken by the mind to have continuity in space and time. Ego is then analyzed in terms of its constituent elements to show that it does not exist in any real way. And meditation practices are designed to lead the student towards an experience of the ephemeral nature of the ego. The venerable Changyam Trungpa, discussing ego development, states, and he says, this development is illusory, the mistaken belief in a self or ego. Confused mind is inclined to confuse itself as a solid, ongoing thing. But it is only a collection of tendencies, events. In Buddhist terminology, this collection is referred to as the 5 skandhas, or heaps. Others, like the Sufis, see ego as a collection of primitive impulses and conditioned patterns, which appear to the unenlightened as a cohesive entity with its own consciousness and volition. The ego or self, in its ordinary state, before Sufi development, is referred to as the commanding self. Idris Shah states, the commanding self is the origin of the individual controlled by a composite consciousness, which is a mixture of hopes and fears, of training and imagination, of emotion and other factors, which make up the person in his or her normal state, as one would ordinarily call it. So I think, here he's highlighting that, I think, let's see if I can distinguish this. I don't know if I totally grok what he's saying here, but there's that there's a perception that we can have that when we look at ourselves, that there's just a being here. There's a whole person or ego. But actually, if you zero in on it, what you see is that there's just tendencies, and that there's an event character of modes and attributes that interact with one another. But if you like zero in on it, you won't find an atomic self there, I think is what they're referring to in that sense. Therefore, things like meditation, right? When you, for example, you know, where essentially, if you sit down, some meditations, sit down is just like, well, try to find yourself, right? And you go and you're like, what you actually find is everything that is a part of you, but it's not you exactly. You notice I have hands, but I'm somehow more than just my hands. I have thoughts, but those thoughts change, and there's more coming, and other ones will go. So I'm not exactly the thinking, right? So if you go look for yourself, you'll realize that there is no one there. In many traditions, then, there is an understanding of ego as somehow false or illusionary. However, given the fact that this ego is in fact the main realm of experience of the man of the world, whose plight we are considering in relation to the relevance to him of spiritual truth, and also given our idea that the ego is a reflection of a deeper essential reality, perhaps this false phenomena is worth investigating in some detail. Why do all human beings develop an ego? And what is the relationship of that ego to spiritual development? We can find some of the answers to these questions in the field of modern psychology. So again, we can hear Almaas here hearkening to, well, okay, maybe it's an illusion. Maybe the personal self and the ego is there's no entity there. It's just an insidious activity, or it's just these kind of attributes of this event character of attributes coming together, right? And therefore it doesn't really exist, or it's not consequential, or it's nothing at all. So kind of get over it, right? Already. But Almaas is going, well, then if that's the case, why does the universe bother growing one? In fact, every person who's born gets one. What's up with that, right? If he's highlighting this contradiction, this internal contradiction. Okay, he goes on. The spiritual traditions view ego as a product of past experience, of what is called the personal history of the individual. Buddhist traditions present a detailed description of ego, but has little clear notion of its development. In the West, it was Freud who began the systematic study of personality. He formulated his description of the structure of the personality, which he called the psychic structure, at the beginning of the century. He identified the ego, superego, and id as the parts of the structure, and investigated the relationship between these units in his attempt to understand mental health and illness. However, he did little investigation of how this structure developed. It remained to modern depth psychology, in particular ego psychology and objects relations theory, to make the structure of the ego and its development the main focus of a whole scientific field, that of developmental psychology. Objects relations theory has become the most widely accepted and consistent branch in this field dealing with ego structure and development. Anyways, I think what Almaas here is getting at is basically, modern psychology has brought something to the picture that had been missing, right? That he is part of what he's doing, right, is using psychology to open up this unexplored territory, right? And specifically here, the personal essence. And we could say that um, like Eastern, Western religions, they all have pretty in-depth, in different ways of modeling out the self, what the self is, right? What its nature is, what are its components, what is its meaning, its structure, right? However, it wasn't until psychology came along that we started to look at, right, the all the substructures of the ego, right? Um, so it's like, all egos, let's say, there's an image, it has to do with, there's an image, a psychic structure, all these kinds of things, right? And therefore, the meditation practice, the prayer practice, all those kinds of things are addressing, loosening that up, addressing that structure, right? Thinning it out, if you will, transcending it. However, it wasn't until psychology that we, one, started to understand how your ego was structured, right? What are its components, parts, like, basically, what was your relationship with your mother? What are the different breaks that happened such that psychic structures were born and defense mechanisms were born out of that? And how did it develop through time? How does the ego develop through time, right? In very precise, specific ways. That really didn't happen until psychology. And so with psychology is this possibility that Almaas is basically realizing in his work, which is, well, what is psychology? And if we go into the substructures of the ego and see it in all of its development and its, all the modern of the last 100 years of psychology, perhaps understanding those things make a more precise and different and new way of going through the ego into what I think he's calling personal essence and the precise relations through them, right? And of course, this only happened in the last 100 years, right? So you can kind of, I could imagine, you can see, Almaas's project, right? In some sense, psychology was the condition of the possibility for Almaas to be able to do this and the way he's doing it. All right, he goes on. It remained to modern depth psychology, in particular ego psychology and objects relations theory, to make the structure of the ego and its development the main focus of a whole scientific field, that of developmental psychology. Objects relations theory has become the most widely accepted and consistent branch in this field dealing with ego structure and development. In this book, we will use many of the concepts developed in objects relations theory because it provides a detailed understanding of the development of the ego. This is useful to our exploration of the respective realms of the man of spirit and the man of the world in several respects. First, it makes very clear the status of the ego as a mental structure from a more scientific viewpoint than the simple claims of the man of the spirit. Second, it makes possible a method of exploration in which this mental status becomes increasingly clear to students, thus making the realm of being more available to experience. Third, it is extremely useful for understanding and overcoming obstacles to inner realization faced by those on the spiritual path. And finally, it supports a model of human development in which spiritual development, that is movement into the realms of being, is seen as a normal part of human life rather than an alternative endeavor incompatible with personal life. All right, so there's this one sentence stood out to me here. Development. It makes possible a method of exploration in which mental status becomes increasingly clear to students, thus making the realm of being more available to experience. And this is what he's really talking about here is what psychology made possible is a whole realm and set of distinctions. And so when you kind of really consider that, and especially consider that you can only relate to what is distinct for you, right? Like, for example, if, say, you don't know anything about computers, all you know is you have to go buy one. And then you go to Best Buy or whatever. That's going to be a really painful experience, right? Because you don't have the distinctions. You don't know what kind of computer you're supposed to buy. You don't have any of that distinctions. Therefore, the world of computers is kind of one big thing. Therefore, you have no basis upon which to relate to it. However, somebody obviously who's, been paying attention and has a bunch of distinctions about computers can walk in, they know exactly what they want. They know what aisle to go to, what section, and right, whether it's Mac or Microsoft or whatever, all the way down to the exact thing to get what they need, right? A lot less painful. So in some sense, psychology is brought a realm of distinctions to the ego and how it functions and how it develops that hasn't been available until 100 years ago. And so the more distinct distinctions we have, right, the more of a grip and relation we can come into relationship with something. And what's cool about distinctions is that the more distinct, the more attention addresses the world, right, the more it makes distinctions. The more distinctions it has, right, the more it can see. The more it can see, the more it has its ability to make distinctions. And so there's this reciprocal, a reciprocal of a mutual self-opening that has everything to do with distinctions. So if you really grok what psychology made possible in the realm of spirituality and the connection between the personal and the impersonal, right, you can get how powerful this is, right? What kind of the possibility that opens up here. It goes on. Objects relations theory begins with the observation that the biological birth of the human infant is not the same as the psychological birth of the individual. The seminal text in this field is Margaret S. Mahler, The Psychological Birth of the Human Infant. This work arises from the observation that the newborn infant has no sense of being a person, and that this sense develops gradually in the first few years of life as the infant interacts with its environment. It is striking to note here how thoroughly each of us takes for granted as obviously valid the sense of being a separate individual entity, even though it is not a given in our original state, but a development out of an original state of undifferentiation and lack of awareness of self or other. The stubbornness of that belief and the reasons behind that stubbornness will become increasingly apparent throughout this book. Heinz Hartmann, considered by some the father of ego psychology, called the original state of the infant the undifferentiated matrix, quote unquote. This matrix is taken to contain in an undifferentiated and undeveloped form the innate predispositions and capacities which will in time develop into the ego with its sense of separate individuality. Mahler, who studied this development by observing children in an experimental setting, called the process of ego development separation/individuation. I think he's quoting Mahler here. We refer to the psychological birth of the individual as the separation-individuation process. The establishment of a sense of separation from and relation to a world or reality, particularly with regard to the experience of one's own body and to the principal representation of the world as the infant experiences it, the primary love object. Like any intrapsychic processes, this one reverberates throughout the life cycle. It is never finished. It remains always active. New phases of the life cycle see new derivatives of the earliest processes still at work. But the principal psychological achievement of this process takes place in the period from about the 4th or 5th month to the 13th or 16th month, a period we refer to as the separation individuation phase. It's funny, I'm smack dab right at the end of that with my son, Teague, who's 17 months. And it's so interesting because he's he definitely, there are just these stages that arise that he goes through. It's like one day all of a sudden I go to hug my wife and he's deeply threatened. Right? We're going through this whole period, which is really strange, where I come near him, near my wife, and he runs up and he says, "Bye-bye, Daddy. Bye-bye, Dad." So there's, it's interesting when you think about that, in that, if you kind of feel into what's going on there, right? His little nervous system is, I guess you can really kind of look at it in terms of this, in this sense, is his anxiety, right, about me coming between him and his primary love object, his mother, right? There's an awareness, right, of a separation is possible, right? Because that, like, how could he be anxious about being separate unless there was some sense of separation going on there, right? So in some sense, you could kind of feel him working out that maybe his mother, right, um, isn't always his own personal limb, right? Uh, and that could be, and if that's true, that can be threatening to him, right? And therefore, daddy, right, is the threat to his merging with his mother in some respects. So it's like you could see, you can, right there, you can kind of feel this very early stage of working this out, right? This point, he goes on, 3 points stand out in this statement. One, there is no sense of a separate individual at the beginning of the life of the human being. Two, the psychological birth of the individual is a psychological achievement resulting from the separation individuation process in the first 3 years of life. Three, this development happens in the relationship to the mothering person, the primary love object, i.e., it is within the context of an object relation. The outcome of the separation individuation process is not consolidated until the fourth subphase of the process. I think this is Mahler, he's quoting. From the point of view of the separation individuation process, the main task of the fourth subphase is twofold. One, the achievement of a definite in certain aspects lifelong individuality, and two, the attainment of a certain degree of object constancy. Now we're starting to get into some of these technical terms, so we can slow down here and go over them as we go along, but I'll go on for now. Object's constancy means, among other things, the capacity to see the other, in this case, the mothering person, as a separate person in their own right. Thus, the child is experiencing himself as an autonomous person, interacting with another autonomous person. Objects relations theory has established that this achievement is the result of certain intrapsychic processes, i.e., it is the result of the building of certain psychic structures through a mental process. Mahler writes about the main processes and structures. He says, quote, the establishment of effective emotional object constancy depends upon the gradual internalization of a constant, positively pathetic inner image of the mother. I think pathetic means, I think it means emotional or cathartic, right? It's got that valence to it. The positive characteristic, inner image of the mother. This, to begin with, permits the child to function separately in familiar surroundings, for example, in our toddler room, despite moderate degrees of tension, longing, and discomfort. Emotional object constancy will, of course, be based in the first place on the cognitive achievement of the permanent object. But all other aspects of the child's personality development participate in the evolution as well. The last subphase, roughly the third year of life, is an extremely important intrapsychic development period, in the course of which a stable sense of entity, self-boundaries, is attained. So I think we can now start to, um, you know, we can start to grok a bit of what he's talking about when he's talking about the distinctions that psychology brings, right? These these like subphases and like development, psycho emotional, physical, cognitive achievements, right? That go on there are an interaction with our biology and the mother in this intricate way. I mean, it's so rich and it's so subtle and there's so much going on there, right? And so object constancy, my understanding of object constancy is it's and it's funny because Teague is totally in this phase where peekaboo is this amazing thing, right? Where all you got to do is 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 block his view for a second, and then you lift your hand, and he's like, "Ah, there he is!" Right? In other words, he's right now his brain can't cognize that the object, in this case, me, right? If he can't see it, it's not there, right? So even if it was just a second ago, right, when I lift my hand and he sees me again, it's like, boom, there I come. It's magical. It's so fun walking around the house and doing that with him for hours at a time, right? And that I believe is object's constancy. So you can imagine, right, that the main object being the mother or the primary caregiver, whoever that is, that how that goes, right, at at really early in life, right, is gonna just be deeply, profoundly impactful on how we can perceive and feel about the world, right? This is that relationship, right? This back and forth as he develops an object's constancy, right? How how the caregiver relates to that, to what degree they're attuned and responsive in the appropriate way and in the appropriate timing, and all of these subtleties, right, are are the very way that our cognitive, emotional, psychic development, right, unfolds. It's how it happens. All right. So with appreciating that, I appreciate you. If let's go ahead and let's bring this one to a close. Oh, I didn't think I went over the housekeeping before. So um, if you are interested in working with me one-on-one, I am currently taking clients. Just email me. My email is in the show notes below. And let me know that you're interested. And then what we'll do is we'll make an appointment to get together and have an exploratory session on Zoom. If you are interested in circling, we have weekly events, we have weekend intensives, and we have year-long trainings. The link for all of that is below in the show notes. Also, we have a Circling into Dialogos course that I teach with John Vervaeke and Christopher, and we have one of those coming up in like a month or so. All that is in the show notes below. Thank you so much.